Out of Sorts by Bernard Taylor. Oh, not the 21st. Paul Gunn said. Whatever made you choose that date? I didn't choose it. That's the day the meeting falls, third Friday in the month. Sylvia shook her head. I told you, there was nothing I could do about it. You could have arranged to hold the bloody thing somewhere else, couldn't you? Does it have to be here? It's my turn, Sylvia said with a sigh. Besides, I'm president. And apart from that, I just wasn't thinking, I suppose. I can't be expected to remember everything. No, but I do expect you to remember the important things. He made a sound of exasperation. Can't you change it? It's bad enough at the best of times, but when the bloody house is filled with people, it's only 3 days away, Sylvia said reasonably. Look, Paul, we planned it weeks ago and it's too late to alter it now. She looked at him entreatingly. Oh, please don't be angry. You'll be all right. No one will bother you. He refused to be entreated or pacified, though, and she watched as he angrily snatched up his newspaper, opened it unnecessarily roughly and submerged himself in its contents. End of conversation, as always. His large, tan hands looked very dark against the white of the paper. It was the hair on them. Thick and black, it made his hands look larger than they were. It was probably a turn-on for some women, she thought. Not to herself, though, not now, if it had ever been. It was to Norma Russell, though, she was quite certain. Norma, with her model's 35 by 25 by 36 figure, her high cheekbones and sleek blonde hair. Paul's hirsute body would be just the thing to appeal to her. If it came to looks, she reflected, it was quite obvious that she herself couldn't compete with anyone like Norma. Oh, once she'd been pretty in a vague, mousa kind of way, but not for years now. Well, she hadn't made any effort, had she? And why should she try, now, when there was no point? And there was no point anymore. More than that, in her eyes it would have seemed the height of stupidity to go to the bother of dressing up, when practically the only man who ever looked at you was your husband, and even when he didn't even see you. Yes, pointless, to say the least. Paul, on the other hand, seemed to have grown sleeker and better looking in an overfed kind of way over the years. Success showed clearly on him, in his clothes, in his body, and his women. Yes, he did look better. That, she supposed, was what contentment and complacency did. She shot him a look of hatred as he lounged, protected by the shield of his paper. Then she turned and went upstairs. This place, too, was a sign of his success. Set apart in this tiny Yorkshire village of Talaford, the house was huge and rambling, exquisitely furnished, further testimony to the years of effort he'd put into his engineering company, now one of the most profitable small businesses in nearby Bradford. In her study Sylvia sat down at her elegant desk, Louis XIV, genuine. Opening her diary she looked again at the date of the meeting. The 21st. No mistake. Then she checked over the Women's Circle Committee list. There would be 6 of them. On the past 3 occasions there'd been only 5 of them, Pamela Horley, Jill Marks, Janet True, and Mary Hanley. This time, though, there'd be 6 again. A replacement had been found for Lily Sloane, who had moved away, a replacement proposed by her and voted in unanimously by the others, Norma Russell. Norma, of course, had so eagerly accepted the offered place on the committee. "Well, if you really want me and you think I can be of help," she'd said. But she hadn't fooled Sylvia for 1 minute. Sylvia knew quite well that Norma's eagerness stemmed from the fact that as every third meeting was held at the Gunn's house, it could only lead to more encounters between herself and Paul. Methodically, Sylvia went through the list, telephoning the members to check that each was okay for the 21st. All except Norma. Her number was engaged. Not that Sylvia needed to worry. If there was one member she knew she could count on, that one was Norma. Pushing her papers away from her, she turned in her chair and looked around her. No expense had been spared in this room. The rest of the furniture was as elegant as the desk on which her elbow rested, as elegant as that in the bedroom next door, the bedroom in which she slept alone, except on those nights when Paul would come to her and use her for the release of frustrations. That's how it had gone on. That's how it would go on, unless something was done to stop it. Oh, she was safe enough, she knew, secure enough in the continuing of her material comforts. As much as Paul would like to see the back of her, he'd never divorce her, or even leave her. He knew which side his bread was buttered, all right. Hence the comfort in which he kept her. And that, surely, was partly the reason for his resentment of her, the fact that he knew that they were irrevocably tied, in sickness and in health, for as long as they both should live, by his dependence upon her. And why, she sometimes asked herself, didn't she leave him? But what would she do if she did? Paul wouldn't support her, and she'd been trained for no particular occupation. For the past 25 years she'd known only this life, marriage to a man whose gratitude for her understanding had in no time worn threadbare. But for all of that, she thought, she could have put up with it, had it not been for his affairs. One after the other they had punctuated the years of their married life. And for that she was resentful, not just because of his infidelity and his rejection of her, but because he gave to those other women what he never gave, never had given, to her, not after the first few months of their courtship, anyway. Those other women, they were allowed to see only the best side of him, the cheerfulness, the gentlemanliness, the solicitousness. She, through her near-total acceptance of the real person, the person they never saw, was doomed to live with it, warts and all. She got up from the desk and stood there in the silent room. It couldn't go on, though. And it wouldn't. No, after the 21st it wouldn't be the same. Come the 21st there'd be some changes made. Norma Russell would be the last, she'd make sure of that. After Norma there wouldn't be any more affairs. When she got downstairs she found Paul on the phone. He started slightly when she suddenly appeared before him, and said shakily into the receiver, voice thick with guile and not a little guilt, "Well, Frank, I think we ought to leave it until our meeting next week, we can discuss it fully then." And Sylvia smiled to herself as she went by him, realizing why Norma's telephone had been engaged, and at the realization that they thought she was so easily fooled. Not she. Frank, indeed. She was a lot smarter than they dreamed. Certainly a damn sight smarter than that vacuous, simpering Norma with her Gucci shoes, Charlie perfume, and Dior sunglasses. Norma Russell, with her sophisticated approach and smug, know-it-all manner, didn't know it all by any means. Not yet. She would in time. Paul left his office early that Friday, came into the house and flopped down onto the sofa saying he had a headache. From past experience Sylvia guessed well enough how he was feeling, but any sympathy she once might have felt for him had long ago vanished. They ate an early dinner and as soon as it was over he went upstairs to the attic. Sylvia followed after a while and quietly opened the door and looked in. He was sound asleep. Backing out again, she turned the key and softly pushed home the heavy bolts. For a second she listened, her ear to door, but no sound came to her through the thick, heavy oak. After a moment she turned and went back downstairs to get ready for the meeting. The women all arrived within a few minutes of each other around 8 o'clock, and with the coffee already made they got down fairly quickly to the business of the evening. That business was the forthcoming summer fete and the women's circle's part in it. The discussion went smoothly, and so it should have, for each of them, with the exception of Norma, had helped organize a dozen similar events in the past. Finally, after much discussion and note-taking, it was seen to be all sorted out. Sylvia summed up the results of their discussion. "All right, then," she said, "I think that's it. So you, Pam, and you, Janet, will get together and organize the refreshments and the baking competition. And you, Jill and Mary, will work on the jumble. And you all know your individual tasks." Smiling at Norma, who returned the smile, she went on, "And that leaves Norma and me to take care of the fancy goods and the white elephant stall. Is that okay?" The next 40 minutes were spent in drinking more coffee and generally talking over the finer points of their various tasks. There was much talk of willing hands and helpers and generous donors, various names were bandied about, and there were the endlessly expressed hopes that on the day the weather would be kind to them. Sylvia began to get the feeling that the meeting would never end. Never before had the conversation of her friends seemed quite so meaningless. But there, never before had she herself had quite such serious matters on her mind. At last, though, it was 9:45, and the meeting was over. As they all got up to go, chattering their goodnights, Sylvia caught at Norma's sleeve, saying, "Oh, Norma, are you in a particular hurry to get away?" Norma's eager-to-please expression didn't fool Sylvia for one moment. "Not at all," she said. "Why? Is there something else I can do?" Now she was like the cat that had found the cream. Not only had she been voted onto the committee, but she had furthermore been chosen to work closely with Sylvia. From now on she'd have a cast-iron excuse for phoning or calling at the house at practically any time. Sylvia smiled as sweetly and as naturally as she could under the circumstances. "I was just wondering whether you'd care to stay behind for a little while so that we can go over, in more detail, a few of the things that you and I will be looking after." "Of course, I'd be glad to. Any time at all, Sylvia. You just let me know." She'd picked up her bag, but now she set it down again at the side of the sofa. "Fine," said Sylvia. "I'll just see the other girls out, then we can talk." When the other members had all gone out into the night, Sylvia came back into the sitting room. As she sat down, Norma said to her, "I suppose Paul hates being around when these hen parties are in session, doesn't he?" Sylvia nodded. "Oh, loathes it, my dear." "Absolutely. Does he, get back late?" "Oh," thought Sylvia, so obviously Norma had told Paul that she'd be coming to the meeting, and it was equally obvious that he'd told her he'd be out somewhere. Well, that was understandable. "I'm sorry." Sylvia said, "What did you ask me?" "Paul, does he usually stay out late when you have your meetings here?" "Oh, yes, usually he does. Not tonight, though." That, Sylvia thought, should get her going. It did. "Oh," said Norma, "is there something different about tonight?" She sounded very casual. Sylvia thought, yes, you could say that. Then she said aloud, the poor love didn't go out this evening. He can't. Oh, you mean he's still in the house? Yes. He couldn't go out. He's just not up to it, poor man. Sylvia eyed Norma's expression, seeing the look of concern that briefly clouded Norma's green eyes. Is he ill? Norma asked. Well, not exactly ill, Sylvia replied. He's just a little out of sorts. Oh, dear, what a shame. Norma sighed. Perhaps you should have phoned and cancelled the meeting. Won't he have been disturbed by all our chatter? Sylvia shook her head. Oh, no, don't worry about that. He won't have heard a thing. He's up in the attic. In the attic? Yes, Sylvia's smile was indulgent. It's his little den, as he calls it. His little retreat. He's got a bed up there, well away from it all. It's much the best place for him at a time like this, when he's not himself. Anyway. She pulled her notepad towards her as if to signify that it was time for them to get on with their work, then, suddenly, with a look of dismay, she dropped her pencil and clapped her hand to her mouth. Oh, my God, she said. What's the matter? Norma stared at her in surprise. Her concern looked genuine. I think I'm losing my mind, Sylvia said. It's going, I swear it's going. My memory. Oh, dear. What is it? What's up? I promised faithfully that I'd drop a few little things over to Mrs. Harrison this afternoon. Poor old lady, she can't get out, what with her bad leg, and she's got her daughter coming for lunch tomorrow. I did all her shopping for her this afternoon, and it's still out there in the kitchen. She glanced at the clock. Just 10 o'clock. I'll bet she's been expecting me all day. How dreadful. She sat as if pondering for a moment, then said, I know she doesn't go to bed till quite late. I think I'll just give her a ring and then take the stuff round to her. I shan't get a chance in the morning, I know. Even as she finished speaking, she was opening her address book and looking up Mrs. Harrison's number. She dialed it and Mrs. Harrison answered almost immediately. She sounded so pleased to hear Sylvia's voice. No, she said, she wasn't been in bed. She was watching the Telly Darts Championship, adding with a little giggle that she quite liked big men. Sylvia, refusing to take no for an answer, then said that she was going to get straight on her bike and bring the groceries round. After all, it was only a couple of miles and no one ever came to harm in Taliford. The call at an end, Sylvia had put on her coat and was picking up the shopping basket before she seemed to remember that Norma was still there. Oh, Norma, my dear, she said. After asking you to stay behind, I now go rushing off like this. I do apologize. Whatever must you think of me? I think you're a very kind person, Norma simpered. That's what I think. And Sylvia, in spite of her loathing for the creature, found herself thinking, how very true. She hitched the handle of the basket more securely over her arm. My bike's just round the side, she said. I'm sorry to go dashing off like this, but I've got to go. She paused. You don't mind letting yourself out, do you? Of course not. Not at all. Oh, bless you. And I wonder, would you be an angel and make sure that I've turned off the gas under the kettle and see that there are no cigarettes burning? Oh, and if Paul should by any chance call out, just tell him I'll be back in an hour or so, or maybe a little longer. Would you mind? She moved to the door. You can let yourself out, can't you? Yes, of course. Oh, thank you so much. Good night, then. Good night. Hardly hearing Norma's reply, Sylvia opened the front door and went to her bicycle in the garage. After carefully securing the basket, she got on and pedaled away. The night was so bright as she sped down the lonely country road that she really had hardly any need of her bicycle lamp at all. From the window Norma watched the red glow of Sylvia's tail light till it disappeared. Then she made a lightning check of the gas taps and the ashtrays. Everything was fine. Yes, everything was fine. Everything was perfect. In the hall she stood quite still and looked up the stairs. Then, after a second or two, she began to climb. She didn't put on the lights. She didn't want to take the chance of being seen through a window by some passing villager. So Paul was in the attic, Sylvia had said. Norma continued up the stairs, past the first floor and on up the next flight, narrower now and turning. At the top she came to a stop, hesitated a moment and then softly called out, "Paul?" Silence. And then she heard a sound. It came from the door a few yards to her right. Moving towards it she saw to her horror that there were two heavy bolts pulled across. Sylvia had locked him in. How could she? There was a key in the lock too. She turned it, releasing the lock. How could Sylvia have done such a thing? Some people. She turned her attention then to the bolts, and with an effort slid them back. It was done. Then, turning the handle, she opened the door a fraction. From the faint glow filtering in from the landing she could see that there was no light in the room, and none coming in from the small, uncurtained window. "Paul?" She whispered his name. She could hear him breathing, heavily, as if he was in a very deep sleep, or... Opening the door wider, she stepped into the room and closed the heavy door behind her. Now in deep darkness she whispered his name again. "Paul?" There came no answer. "Paul," she said, a little louder now, "are you there?" "It's me, Norma. I've come to pay you a little surprise visit." The room was swallowed up in shadow. She could see nothing. She could hear nothing but the breathing. "Paul, darling, is that you?" she said. She listened. The breathing, somehow it didn't sound like him. It didn't sound quite right. "Paul," she said, "Sylvia told me you weren't quite yourself tonight, so I've come to cheer you up a bit, if I can." She laughed lightly, nervously into the dark. The sound of his breathing was growing louder, coming a little nearer. "Paul," she said, "oh, come on, darling. Don't fool about." Suddenly the moon, the full moon, was no longer obscured by the clouds. Suddenly the room was bathed in light. And she saw the bars at the window, thick, metal bars. She noticed, too, the complete absence of furniture. There was only straw on the floor. She became aware, too, of the strong, rank animal smell that permeated the air around her. And then she saw Paul coming towards her. In the brilliant silver light of the full moon he lunged towards her and she felt him reach out with one huge clawed paw, felt herself wrenched forward, towards the great snout, the great fangs that opened wide, dripping in anticipation. She heard the guttural sound from deep in his throat. The sound that came from her own throat, a small, pleading cry of terror, was cut off before she'd hardly had a chance to utter it. At Mrs. Harrison's, Sylvia looked at her watch. It was almost 11. She put down her cup, got to her feet and took up her empty basket. It had been so nice, she said, but she really must get back. There'd be a lot of cleaning up to do. Besides, Paul might start to wonder where she was. He didn't usually worry, but he could get very funny when he was out of sorts. There was just no telling. "It's probably the full moon," Mrs. Harrison said with a little chuckle. "Did you notice there's a full moon tonight? I swear it makes a difference to some people. You might not believe this, but I'm sure it used to affect my Ralph. He used to go right off his food. Wouldn't eat a thing. No appetite at all." Sylvia looked out of the window at the moon's big, white, smiling face. "Oh," she said with a little smile, "I can't say it takes Paul like that. Just the opposite, in fact. When he's not his usual self, like today, a bit out of sorts, he gets absolutely ravenous. Such an appetite you wouldn't believe. Like he hasn't eaten in a month." The end. Next story. Wick's End by Joanna Parypinski. Bitter cold, it was, as I entered the roadside tavern, a mutinously archaic structure, rudely built, whose splintered wood shrieked with each passing gust of wind and whose hostile atmosphere attracted only the least savory of patrons. I had taken a liking to the place, to the world-weary travelers who occupied its rickety stools and the brand of smoky darkness one finds in such a highway hovel. It was, perhaps, my favorite haunt on October 31st, this night of mischief. And the night was a cold one, indeed, as the heat within the tavern failed to thaw that arctic hollow within my chest. I could feel my very bones creaking and grinding. 'Tis a pity, to be so old yet trapped upon this earth, to have suffered these many years and all these many Octobers without making an end of it. How I can hardly recall, now, the stony cliffs and crumbling castles of old Ireland, where I had spent my youth as a ragged boy whose knack for deception outweighed his innately limited sense of caution. My memories do begin to fail me, though, as the passage of time whittles them away. The uncanny turning of the years blurs vivid details into a streak of gray. The prevailing spirit of the New England roadside is one of ineffable solitude and mystery. I find great pleasure in the superstition these wandering souls still cling to even in a modern and, I suppose, more scientific time. I may sit, particularly on a Halloween evening, and please myself listening to wondrous tales of ghosts and haunted roads, haunted taverns, haunted schools, haunted train tracks, all a kind of gloomy fancy. Tonight I came into the tavern seeking these chilling delights, for it was yet another Halloween, and my light was growing dim. The flame had faded to the dull red glow of exhausted coals. I needed a new flame, and I needed a mark for this evening, one best chosen from among the scarred and forgotten barflies who dwelled in seedy motels and lived nomadic lives upon trucks and motorcycles. Here there were no families, no trick-or-treating children, no one in costume, and they all sat in the dusky light and drank as if it were any other evening of the year, but for the pervasive atmosphere of ghoulish enchantment. I sat myself at the unvarnished bar and set my dying lantern beside me, ordered a whiskey, and proceeded in my second favorite pastime of getting drunk. I listened to the men behind me betting on a game of pool, and the Hells Angels telling favorite ghost stories of nameless abandoned roads and old stone bridges across America. I saw truckers typing on their cell phones and pulling baseball hats low over their foreheads for a snooze. The door swept open again, and a night wind beat its way inside with the woman who brought it through the threshold. She wore a leather jacket and black boots, her wild hair was threaded with gray, and her eyes were black as pits within a face carved as if from wood. She sat down at the bar, alone, 2 stools from mine, and she smiled when she ordered, a kind of toothy and devilish smile that revealed several gold fillings. She drank some murky liquid clinking with ice, and she held the glass with a gnarled, suntanned hand that looked as if it were made of leather. "You gonna stare at me all night, honey, or you gonna pay for this drink?" she said with a smoker's rasp, without turning her head toward me. "That depends," I said. "On what?" "Your answer." I took a sip. "Trick, or treat?" Her laugh was like the wind huffing through dead leaves. She tossed a few bills onto the bar, which the barkeep snapped up and made disappear. "On second thought, I'm not taking no treats from you." I smiled. "Very well. Tell me a good one, old man," she said. She swillied her drink and finally turned to face me. Her irises were as black as her pupils. "A ghost story. That's the real currency around here on Halloween." The clack of balls striking one another on the pool table sounded like a crack of thunder, although the night outside was clear and cloudless, with only the thinnest drape of mist. I had found my mark, thus did I decide to play my game with her. I sipped my whiskey in contemplation and replied, "I'll have to think on it, but I'll make a wager with you. Whoever's story proves the more frightening pays for the next round of drinks." She laughed again, a grim sound. "And if nobody wins?" "If neither concedes to the other, we'll simply tell another." She eyed me up and down as if I had said something terribly amusing to her. "All right. Who goes first?" From an inner pocket of my overcoat, I produced an aged and faded coin, the images in relief smoothed and worn down but still visible enough. On one side, the St. Patrick's farthing depicted the noted saint carrying a staff and driving the snakes from Ireland, and on the other, King David playing a harp. I held up each side to show her. "Let's call this one heads, and this tails." "Tails," she said. "Where'd you get that old thing?" I flipped the coin, and it landed with a spinning rattle atop the bar. When at last it settled, we both leaned in to see which side faced up. "Well, that's me, then," she said. After swigging the remainder of her drink, she pushed the empty glass away from her, swiveled toward me, crossed her legs, and leaned an elbow casually on the bar. At last, she spoke. "Hear the one about the lonely traveler on the highway?" "On this highway, matter of fact. The traveler sees a light in the woods, and because he's cold and hungry, and no cars been by, so he can't hitch, he sets off into the trees. All's he can hear's the crickets singing to the moon, and that strange unquiet you get alone in the forest with a darkness so thick you feel it. But he's heading toward the light, which he sees now is coming from the windows of a little shack. Now, this is Halloween time, and some years ago, so he don't have a phone to call someone, but he's just a lonely hitchhiker. Who's he gonna call anyway? As he's coming to the house, he senses he's being watched, and then he sees something that stops him dead. There's faces all around that house, watching him. Faces with glowing eyes and mouths. And he thinks these here are ghouls, this place is haunted, and he should head back for the road, but then the door of the house creaks open, and a woman steps up, and she's just an old woman, not a ghost or goblin or other fantastic creature of the night, so the man laughs and says he thought there was something sinister going on, pointing to the faces. "Those are just my jack-o'-lanterns," says the woman, and the man don't know how he could have been so foolish. He comes closer, knowing now they're just lit pumpkins, hoping to ask the kind woman for some food and drink. Only when he gets up to the doorway, she says, "I think you will make a fine jack-o'-lantern," and he looks again and sees those lanterns aren't pumpkins at all but human heads, hollowed out and filled with candles so their empty sockets and gaping mouths glow. He turns to run away, but he's no match for the witch. She has her way, and damned if his headless body don't walk a few steps before it dies. The barkeep appeared as if from nowhere, just then, and refilled her drink. She lifted it to him in cheers and threw it back. "Very good," said I. She looked me over, gauging my reaction, but then her eyes lit on my lantern. "That a turnip?" "Why, yes," I said, lifting it by the handle and bringing it closer for her to see. The turnip had taken on the mummified guise of a dead man's face, with a sharp gash carved in for a mouth and 2 slashes for eyes. Within that hollowed vegetable, the coals smoldered low and red, burned down almost to nothing. "Who exactly are you, mystery man? Would you like to hear about me, or would you like to hear my ghost story?" She removed a cigarette from her pocket and lit it, filling the bar with a heady smoke. Yes, this place was a revolt against modern norms and laws. No one seemed to mind. It was a last refuge of those who lived in the past. Her smoke drifted into my face, and she motioned for me to tell my story. In the twilight of a century-long past, there lived a miserable drunk, a wretched thief and swindler, an insufferable and despised man. Each night, from dusk until dawn, he sat in the town pub and drank himself into oblivion. On his way to the pub one night, a fog-riddled late October night with sea salt in the air, he happened upon a grotesque and rotten corpse lying in the road. The polite thing, in this case, might be to notify the authorities of the body's presence, but this man met the body with indifference and continued on his way. He was not far past the place where the body lay when he heard a rustle from behind him. He turned and in the full enchanted moonlight observed the corpse rise up to its feet. Horror! His own feet were rooted to the ground, and thus he could not dash away in fright. The corpse approached and proclaimed himself the devil, here to take the man's soul to hell. One could not help but believe the walking corpse, for its eyes gleamed a feverish red, and its black lips split in a terrible grin. The man had only one request before he agreed to go with the devil, one last drink. Thereupon the devil did transform his appearance to disguise himself, and they went to the pub so the man could have his final drink. When they finished their ale, this man, so full of gall, dared to ask the devil to pay the bar tab. Certainly, he would swindle his final drink for free. The devil, secretly impressed by the man's audacity, transmogrified himself into a sixpence. Pleased with himself, the man snatched up the coin, but instead of paying the bartender, he placed the coin in his pocket where he was also carrying a crucifix. With this powerful symbol beside him, the devil could not escape from his present form. There is a reason this man had made it through his life on his skills of trickery and deceit, and thus he made a deal. He would set the devil free, but only if he would be spared his life another 10 years. Naturally, the devil agreed, and the man enjoyed 10 more years without disturbance. I took a sip of whiskey to quench my parched throat and waited for her assessment. "Fair," she said, "but no scarier than mine." "I disagree." We both drank. "Well," I said, "I suppose it's a draw." We both paid for our drinks and grew quiet with rumination while a game of cards erupted in fierce betting behind us. I recalled my youthful days spent cheating at such games and very much would have liked to join them, but alas, I had begun my duty for the night and it must be completed by morning, or the consequences, I feared, would be intolerable. "So, next round," said the woman, referring not to the empty drinks that sat before us. "Let us venture outside to give our next stories the proper atmosphere," I suggested. She looked at me, then at the door, turning over the idea, "There is great reason to fear strangers in these lonely parts of the country," and nodded. We took our leave into the brisk night, pervaded with that chill silver mist that cast a kind of apparition over the distance. My lantern had diminished considerably and now gave off only the merest light, which hardly was able to filter through the thick, dried flesh of the turnip, and only its eyes and mouth now offered their failing glow. Despite the whiskey, I grew cold again, and with the lantern so near dead, my confidence soon doused itself as well. I had perhaps chosen a challenge with the woman this Halloween, having grown bored with spineless marks in the past, but now in the occluded moonlight I grew concerned that things would not go in my favor this evening. But no, such thoughts could never suit me. I always got what I needed in the end. Beyond the dejected tavern lay a vast tract of black forest, rising gently in the distance into a gradual hill beyond which the horizon vanished in darkness and mist. Only the moon revealed the sharp contours of tall trees and wasted branches reaching their crooked limbs to the heavens as in desperate prayer. Dead brown leaves crackled where we tread as the woman and I slowly approached this wood, both seeming to lead the other closer and closer to its shadowed depths. "Well, honey, I need time to think of another story. You go first this time," she said, her voice brimful of smoke and a kind of self-satisfied and secret knowledge. She drew toward the wood, and did I lead her there, or did I follow? Which of us was leading the other, I wondered, into those ominous trees? "The tale of the stingy man who bested the devil is not yet over," I said. 10 years later, the man was out walking alone through an apple orchard. We reached the barrier of trees and continued creeping, together, into their dark embrace. Once more, he found a putrescent corpse upon the ground, exposed to the sun and its dead flesh writhing with scavenging insects. He knew at once that this was no ordinary corpse, but the man did not attempt to run. He knew his time had come. The devil had returned, as promised, to collect the man's soul, but never had it been in the man's nature to capitulate without a final request, this time, one last apple. At first, the devil attempted to refuse him, but the man persisted. Thinking there could be no harm in granting him this particular request, the devil grudgingly climbed the nearest tree to retrieve an apple, and while he was within the branches the man carved a cross into the bark of the trunk, thus trapping the devil up the tree. And so he made another bargain. This time, he would release the devil only if the devil would agree never to take his soul to hell, and he agreed. We had ventured deeper into the dense wood now so that the light of the tavern had vanished behind us. Woodland sounds of owls, crying animals, and insects echoed through the quiet. These I did not fear, but the woman beside me, too, seemed unafraid, and this ignited my concern once more that somehow I had chosen wrong. No, confound these blasted thoughts, let her enjoy a final walk in the woods, for I would kill her yet. The woman laughed with that voice like grinding tree bark and told me this story was even less frightening than the last. "Old age has made you mild," she suggested. "That isn't quite the end," I said, hurrying to the conclusion. After a long life, the stingy man died alone, of old age. His soul was turned away from the light, and turned away, of course, from that seething pit of terror known as hell, as the devil kept his promise. Alas, the man would be condemned to roam in darkness for eternity, but that the devil offered him a burning coal to light his way. Ahead, through the gloaming, I perceived a distant light, as that of a will-o'-the-wisp floating incorporeally on the wings of shadow. We trod on leaves and brush, and ducked beneath low-hanging branches, each still leading the other, now, ever closer to that mysterious light. And let me guess, he wanders still, undead, so watch out. Honey, there's scarier things out here than that. Urban legend says there's a killer in these woods. I heard tell each Halloween they find a burned-out body around here, like its insides spontaneously combusted. What do you think of that? Her mouth curled into a terrible grin, and I wondered if she knew that she would be this year's victim, and if so, how she could smile that infernal smile. The blasted woman shook her head and hiked more swiftly now, directly toward that light, which beckoned like a gleaming beacon, and I hastened to keep pace. My lantern swung on its handle, emitting only the barest semblance of light now. Time was running out. It was rare that I ever let it get so low, and I knew I played a dangerous game in waiting until the very last moment, yet I had grown bored over the years, and I very much wanted to see the fear in this woman's eyes before I killed her. I wanted to see the horror of her recognition when she discovered that I'd bested her. My pride, as always, prevailed over my sense of caution. The light ahead of us, I saw, was coming from a house ensconced within the trees. It was a ramshackle construction of stone and wood whose planks were stained and rotting with fungus, the discoloration reaching up to the sharply peaked roof, and whose tall windows emitted their light. A harsh light, too white to be fire, filtered through the soft curtain of the fog. Ahead of that ominous house, which seemed to repel me with a metaphysical force, I slowed my pace, and the woman did likewise. When she turned to look curiously at me, I fixed her with a terrible grin. "Look upon this, here," I said, holding aloft my lantern, which was perilously close to dying. "I require a new flame. It goes out each Halloween, you see, and I must relight it just before it dies or I shall be left in darkness." I reached out for the woman. The only way to light these coals is with the burning flame of a human soul. Now is when, in each of these many long years I have been playing this game, terror commonly flashes before the eyes of my mark. This woman, though, this maddening woman, simply laughed, an eerie, unnerving, and echoic sound that scraped the eardrums as with sandpaper or rough bark, a horrid, unbearable laugh of some terrible substance I can hardly describe. "I know," she said. "I know just who you are, Jack. Don't you recognize me?" We had arrived, now, at the house that emitted the white light into the forest from its tall and prominent windows, and around this woodland cottage did lay a dozen or more glowing faces, which startled me to see, but they were only jack-o'-lanterns, of course. My mind conjured up the witch from the woman's story, and it was then that I noticed the jack-o'-lanterns were not, indeed, carved from pumpkins but from human heads, hollowed out, their eyes burned from their skulls, and shining internally with candlelight, which glowed a hellish orange from their sockets and their gaping mouths. Worse still, I discovered with absolute horror, were the identities of these severed heads, for I recognized in each one a mark from Halloweens gone by, a person whose soul I had harvested from my lantern and whose burned-out husk of a body I had inevitably left behind in these very woods, to be found or devoured by animals. It was not possible. It was some magic the likes of which I had not seen in many years, to have preserved each head so well as my own lantern, which I have carried these many centuries of undeath. There was, however, one pumpkin among the ghastly heads, and its carven face very much did mirror that borne by my turnip lantern, the self-same horrid gash for a mouth, shrieking in terror, and the hasty slits for eyes. "What is this?" I could only stammer. "What is this?" "That one I have carved specially for you," she said. I looked down upon my own lantern, alack! It was going out. The coal was turning black, and soon I would be unable to relight it and forced to spend the rest of my days, years, centuries, millennia, in perpetual darkness. Here it is, going out within a moment, out, and my panic drove forward my hand to grasp the woman, whose neck I seized in my aged and clawed appendage. As I grasped her, yes, she began to light up with flame from within. Her eyes and laughing mouth began to glow with her burning soul. But why? Why was she laughing? Just now my mark should be screaming with torture as her insides are incinerated, but she was laughing while she burned. And then she said at last, "You fool! I am the devil, I have no soul." I had only a moment to experience this shock, and she had only a moment to witness and relish in my horror, before my own trick backfired upon me, and all at once the flame was quenched from her and rushed, instead, into me, for I did still have a soul, the only thing keeping me here on this earth. My soul ignited into flame, and I felt, then, the growing heat, and the wretched burn inside that cold and blasted hollow where my heart should be, and the flames growing within my ancient, creaking body as they charred my skeleton to ash. You cannot fathom the agony of being burned alive from the inside out, of feeling your soul devour the body you inhabit. Oh, it is torture, a torture I have inflicted upon innumerable individuals. I opened my mouth to scream and knew the flames leaped out between my rotten teeth, and my vision danced and flickered with those flames so that the woman grinned at me as through a film of fire. "I have been waiting a long, long time to seek my revenge on thee, stingy Jack." As I watched, her face began to rot, her eyeballs bulged from swollen, putrid sockets, her lips turned black with gore, her flesh bubbled, contorted, turned green with putrefaction. Thus did she transform into an awful, laughing corpse. "The devil does not like to be tricked," she said with glee. My body crumbled as I was transformed into a flame. The devil took this flame and placed it within that jack-o'-lantern that she had carved specially for me. I was a strange sort of formless consciousness within the orange gourd, and I wondered then, with mounting dread, whether the souls I took from my lantern remained somehow alive while I carried them in my lantern, if they were forced to experience all that I did, and live in anguish as a flame, alive, somehow alive. I did not have long to wonder upon this awful possibility, for the devil bent forward then and blew out my light. And now, snuffed out but still existing, I am in a primeval and purgatorial darkness for all eternity, not dead, not alive, but a bodiless consciousness. Pity me, mortal souls, for though ye will die, and some will go to that wretched pit of despair that is known as hell, you will never face the terror and the endless madness of eternity as I will, I, Jack of the Lantern. The end. Final story. I am a human voodoo doll. Have you ever fallen in love so bad that it hurts? Where you have to force yourself to not even think about the person, because otherwise your mind will run rampantly down a spiral of uncontrollable obsession? I can't taste food without remembering her laughing at my cooking, which she affectionately named Bachelor Chow. Music is damp and muted without her singing along to the lyrics, and my morning alarm torments me with the prospect of another day where she isn't mine. Maybe I held on too tightly, maybe not tight enough. Maybe it wasn't something I did, but something I am. It just seemed like the harder I tried, the further away Ellis drew, until one day she said she needed space. It was nauseating how polite and apologetic she was about it. She kept calling every other day to see if I was okay, and at first those gestures were my lifeline. I spent the whole day looking forward to the few minutes I would hear her voice again. I thought it was proof that she regretted her decision, and that it was only a matter of time before she came back to me. Now I know it was only pity. Apparently the space Ellis needed was already filled by someone else. I thought Nick the flabby-faced man-child was just a harmless friend. They were together almost immediately after she left me though, and the more I think about it, the more I wonder if it hadn't started even before. All those days when she just felt like doing her own thing? I guess that makes Nick her thing. You'd think that knowing she betrayed me would make it easier to stop loving her, but somehow it only made the obsession stronger. I can't move on with my life, and I'm running out of strength to keep pretending it will be okay. It's been 2 months since the breakup, and she still keeps trying to call and check in on me. I've stopped answering her. Text messages and voicemails are deleted before they're opened. I'm not writing this as an excuse or justification for what I was about to do. I was past the point of having to prove anything to anyone. And yeah, maybe it makes me a coward, but I didn't care about that either. I was done being treated like this, done feeling like this. I was just done. Amitriptyline is an antidepressant which failed to alter the world from shades of gray. Oxazepam is a sleeping pill which was inept against my thoughts of her. But half a bottle of each, and I wouldn't wake up again. It was supposed to be a very peaceful way to go. The taste was so bitter I could barely keep it down, but after that my mind just wiped clean. My last thoughts were that if I could do it all again, I would have still gone down the same road. The time I shared with her was still worth the place where it must end. But it didn't end. I opened my eyes and squinted against the afternoon sun. I was lying in my bed, covers pulled up to my chin. Both the bottles of pills were gone. How did I wake up from that? I didn't even feel nauseous anymore. Was I supposed to just go find another method and try again? Or maybe this was God's way of giving me another chance. Did I even still care about her? I crawled over to my laptop and immediately checked Ellis's Facebook page. I could use her photos as a test. If I could look at them without being overwhelmed with pain, then maybe she'd changed her profile picture. Flabby face was kissing her cheek. A feeling like acid worked its way down my chest. Nothing had changed. Nothing was ever going to change the way I felt, no. Something had changed. Her page was full of sympathetic prayers and comments. You were an angel. God must have needed you back. I'm so sorry to hear what happened. Let me know if there's anything I can do to help. I skimmed up to the top of the page. This was posted last night. This is Nick. I thought I should let you all know that Ellis died from a lethal dose of sleeping pills last night. I found her unconscious when I visited this morning and rushed her to the hospital, but it was too late. Message me for details. I was completely dumbfounded. I had taken the pills, but somehow she had died instead. I had been thinking about her right before I went, so is there some way it had been transferred to her? It seemed impossible, but the coincidence of her going the same way on the same night seemed ludicrous. Besides, hadn't she been happy with Nick? My racing thoughts were shattered by a sudden fierce knocking on my door. Was it Ellis? Of course not. Don't be stupid. I was about to open it when they knocked again. Police. "We have a few questions to ask you." I froze, my hand still on the handle. It really was my fault she was dead. But how? I hadn't even seen her in weeks. Somehow what I did to myself happened to her, and the police being here proved it. Even if it was something else, my mind was too overwrought to begin to deal with them. I live on the ground floor, so it wasn't hard to just grab my keys and duck out my bedroom window. I didn't know where to go, but I just needed to drive around for a while and clear my head. I unlocked my car and was about to climb in when, "Police! Stop right there!" Two officers were emerging from my building. As soon as they caught sight of me, they began jogging. I should have just talked to them, but I felt compelled to run from the nameless clenching guilt and terror which possessed me. I jumped in the car and floored the pedal, tearing out of my apartment parking lot like I was running for my life. Last night I had been ready to die, but now I knew there was some greater power working through me. This was supposed to be my fresh start. I couldn't stop yet. The police car was right behind me. Sirens blared in accusation. My mind was at war with itself with panic. I could barely breathe. My familiar neighborhood looked alien to me. I screeched around the corner and up the overpass leading onto the freeway at breakneck speed. I was just becoming aware of the implications of my escape when a horrendous impact sent me spinning out of control. The police cruiser rammed me to prevent me getting on the freeway. The car spun 2 complete circles and smashed into a concrete barrier. The screech of metal was replaced with the roar of the airbags, and then everything went black. I hadn't been wearing my seatbelt, but that might have saved my life as I was thrown clear. I must have only been out for a few seconds though, because coming to I could still feel the warmth of my burning car behind me. The officers hadn't been so lucky. When they rammed my car, their car must have lost control in the opposite direction and fallen off the overpass. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. The cruiser had flipped onto its roof, crushing the officers beneath it. But me? Somehow I didn't have a scratch. My crazy theory must not have been so far off. I take the pills, but I was thinking about Ellis and so she died instead. My car was hit, but I was thinking about the police and they suffered from the crash. Both times I walked away clean. I couldn't stay to ponder my discovery though, because I already heard more sirens approaching from the distance. I took off by foot and began running through the streets. I had to test my theory. Just one more time. If it was true, then some divine agent had resurrected me and I really did have something to live for. If it wasn't, then I was a suicidally depressed loner who was wanted by the police. I had nothing to lose and everything to gain, so it was time to put it all on the line. But with who? I couldn't just endanger an innocent stranger. I didn't want anyone else to get hurt except Nick of course. If it's anyone's fault Ellis died, it must have been his. It was his job to make her happy, wasn't it? His job to notice if something wasn't right. Hell, the scumbag went behind my back and stole her from me. If anyone deserved to suffer, it was him. I didn't want it to be clean either. Both other times I walked away unharmed, so I wanted him to suffer the way he made me suffer. I wanted to bring him to that point of hopeless isolation and rejection and leave him stranded beyond the hope of return. And more than anything, I wanted to be there to watch it happen. I found him at Ellis's apartment. Her old apartment, I guess, since she didn't live there anymore. I watched him carrying a box of her things to put into his car. She'd just died that morning, and he was already looting her stuff like a grave robber. There's no denying that I was going to enjoy watching him burn. Because I was going to burn with him. I continued watching him from behind the hedge which surrounded the parking lot. I watched his face while I poured gasoline over my head, imagining what it would look like after it lit up. Unspeakably grotesque. Either he would die, or the burns would disfigure him for life. He would be alone, just like I was after he stole her from me. It still wasn't good enough though. I wanted him to see me when it happened so he'd understand why. I waited by his car until he came back out with another box. The gasoline was cool against me, clinging comfortingly like a second skin. It burned like hell where it ran into my eyes, but I forced them to stay open. It was worth it to see the look on his face. "Oh shit man, didn't see you there," he said. "I guess you heard about Elista." I grinned. He still didn't know why I was here. I hadn't looked forward to anything so much since Ellis left me. "Can I help you with something?" he asked. "How come you're all wet?" I twirled the lighter in my fingers. His eyes fell on it for the first time. Then he looked at my face, then back at the lighter. Then at the rainbow reflections in the pooling liquid around my feet. His eyes bulged, and I smiled wider. Now he gets it. "This is for Alice," I said. Flick. Flick. Whoosh. The fire started at my face and then swiftly engulfed my entire body. Nothing in my life prepared me for that pain. I stood there watching him for as long as I could, waiting for the spark to ignite in his skin. Waiting for the flesh to melt from his face and his bones to crack and splinter. Someone call the ambulance. Or the fire department. Or shit I don't know, get someone. I heard him shouting, but I couldn't see him anymore. My eyes must have boiled out of my skull. He said something else, but I couldn't hear him over the sound of my own scream which tore out of my body like my soul seeking release. For the third time I blacked out, but I was still grinning the whole way. Soon I would wake up, and he would be the one who burned. Ellis had stopped by my apartment the night I took the pills. She was worried about me after I didn't reply to any of her calls or messages. Shit, she might have even still cared for me, but I guess I'll never know now. She must have been overwhelmed with guilt and grief at seeing me like that and taken the rest of the pills herself after she got back home. I was later informed of the pool of vomit in the corner of my bathroom where I had regurgitated my own lethal dose. The police hadn't died when their cruiser turned over. They'd just been pinned inside and unable to pursue me. They had only come by my apartment because their investigation had revealed Ellis visiting me on the night of her death. But Nick did burn. He had forced himself through the flame to get my burning clothes off and smother the fire with his body. If it wasn't for him, I never would have survived until the ambulance came. His face isn't scarred like mine, but he'll have the marks on his arms and chest for the rest of his life. He's a good man. Ellis would have been very happy with him if it wasn't for me. So I was wrong. I was too maddened by grief and self-loathing to understand until it was too late. There's no such thing as a human voodoo doll. There is no God working through me, or spirit of universal justice that makes everyone get what they deserve, but if my experience has one redeeming quality, then let it be a warning. No one should make life-altering decisions as a result of an emotional state. No matter how convinced your heart is that something is true, wait to act until your mind is caught up. If I had stopped for a moment to talk to Ellis, I would have seen how much she still cared, and I never would have done this to myself. If I hadn't run from the police, there never would have been this accident. And if I'd only thought my theory through. Well, one day we will all wake up as a different person than who we are now, and we will learn to forgive those who hurt us, and forgive ourselves for hurting others. Ellis is gone though, and the scars I'll have to remember her by will never heal.